Hello everyone, happy Thursday with just one more day left till the weekend. Welcome to Within the Frame, where we delve deeper into the top stories taking place not only in South Korea but across the globe. I'm Kim Bo-kyung. The war in Ukraine enters its 11th month already, with the one-year mark coming up. Still, Ukraine is continuing its fight against Russia with the support of Western allies. And recently, there has been intense fighting focused on the salt mining town of Soledar in Ukraine's eastern Donetsk region. Amid such intense battles, Ukraine's high officials said Ukraine was suggested to accept a so-called Korean-style armistice. What is the situation like in Ukraine right now? What does Korean-style armistice mean, and when would peace come to Ukraine? For an in-depth analysis on the war in Ukraine and how it could go this year, we have Professor Lim Eun-jung, Associate Professor of Kongju National University, on the line from Gongju. Hello, Professor. Welcome to the show.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
And we also have Malcolm Davis, Senior Analyst from Australian Strategic Policy Institute, on the line from Canberra. Malcolm, thank you for your time.
Thank you for having me.
All right, first question to Professor Lim. First, on what has been happening recently. Russian troops and Wagner Group mercenaries were so eager to get the control of the eastern town of Soledar and have even claimed to have secured it, though Kyiv says the fight goes on. Why is Soledar a key town for Russia to win, and what significance does it have regarding the war?
Sure. I think I can highlight 2 or 3 points about the importance of Soledar. Number one, strategically, Soledar, its location is very much important because it's close to, it's a kind of, it's like a gate to the Bakhmut, where the Russia and the Ukraine, they are fighting very, very severely. Bakhmut also as has been regarded as a very important traffic center. So as long as the Soledar is geographically close to the Bakhmut, it looks like Russia regards Soledar as a very important step to control over the Bakhmut as well. So its geographic location is definitely important. Secondly, it does have a very big salt mine, which is very interesting. Of course, you mentioned those, Wagner mercenary. We know the leader or the founder who created the Wagner a mercenary, whose name is Yevgeny Prigozhin. He is, of course, close to the President Putin, and it looks like probably they are interested in the salt mine, which can be lucrative too. So with those kind of, strategic or other some economic reasons, interests, Soledar looks like a very much important battle to win over.
Right. So first of all, it's because it's the gate to the Bakhmut, and also because of the resources the Soledar has. Now, could you give us a picture of how the situation is in other regions aside from the Soledar?
Well, again, the Bakhmut was very much, as I mentioned, the fighting between the two is very, very severe. Russia even used incendiary bomb, which is, of course, we all know it's against the international law. So as long as the Bakhmut, the battle in the Bakhmut is that much serious, these are belong to the Donetsk region. So those, eastern part of the those Ukraine is also in a very serious situations. If we go down to the south, Kherson, for example, Ukraine, they restored Kherson, which was a very meaningful victory for the Ukraine. But so far along this, all the line, we do see kind of, stalemate-like situation these days, I think, which probably is one of the reasons reasons why those, Korean War armistice-like negotiation is on the table, or it's discussed behind the curtain.
Right, so it was the general situation, what's happening in Ukraine. Now, moving on to Malcolm, as Russia's invasion of Ukraine enters its 11th month, there are reports that Russia's artillery fire is down dramatically from its wartime high, and in some places by as much as 75%. How do you assess such reports? I mean, is this a sort of a sign that Russia is struggling due to low supplies?
Look, that's possible. Certainly the Russians have been using large amounts of artillery and rocket fire throughout the last 11 months, and it could be that they are running low on supplies. But it's equally possible that the Russians are reducing their fires in order to conserve resources in anticipation of a large offensive that they intend to carry out in late February. There's been some suggestions that this could come even from Belarus as one possibility, down towards Kyiv, but it's also possible that they would try to gain the initiative in the Donbass around the Bakhmut area. So I think it's hard to say which of those explanations is the most likely, but all the indications are that the Russians are planning a large offensive. So that does tie in with a decision to reduce artillery usage now.
All right, Malcolm, one more question to you. Around 100 Ukrainian troops are said to be heading to the United States as soon as next week to begin training on the Patriot surface-to-air guided missile defense system. What benefits can the Patriot system offer? Could it be a game changer to Ukraine?
Well, it's going to take a while for the Patriot system to be introduced operationally, and so far the Americans have only given one battery, which is about 20 launches. So that's not a huge number of Patriot missiles. The key reason why the Americans are giving the Patriots to Ukraine is anticipation of Russia getting access to Iranian ballistic missile capabilities called the Fateh and the Zolkafar, which would be far more devastating than the sort of drones that they've been using so far in attacks on Ukrainian electricity and water supplies. And it's much more difficult for the existing Ukrainian air defenses to stop those ballistic missiles from Iran. So I think the Americans are trying to prevent the Russians from being able to do decisive blows against Ukraine, and Patriot is one way to defend against that.
Right. Now, Professor Lim, according to Alexei Danilov, who is Secretary of Ukraine's National Security and Defense Council, Ukraine has been suggested by Russia to accept a Korean-style armistice. What is this armistice on the Korean Peninsula, and what does a Korean-style armistice mean in Ukraine's war against Russia?
Well, probably we need to recall the history. Again, the Korean War was very bloody, long-lasting war. It lasted more than 3 years. And if we recall again all these memories and history, again, at the beginning of the war, of course, the North came down and, our government went down to the Busan. But later in the General MacArthur made those, famous Incheon landing. Then, the whole war situation changed dramatically. But the thing is, again, China, they joined. So they sent the people's, those, the voluntary army, people's voluntary army. So again, ever since then, all this, war became the real international war. So it lasted again more than 3 years. So having had all this very difficult situations, again, this armistice did not end the war, but it brought again the cessation of exchanging all this violence. So in that sense, again, if Ukraine and Russia wanted to avoid a further sacrifice, again, the cessation of fire can be, I think, considered as an option. But the thing is, again, armistice is not the end of the war. So in that sense, of course, back then, again, during the Korean War, our first president, Lee Seung-man, he was against the idea, armistice, and he wanted to go north. So similarly, these days, again, President Zelensky or some Ukrainian leaders might not be that satisfactory with that kind of idea either. But anyhow, if they would want to avoid a further sacrifice, armistice, I think, can be considered as an option.
Right. Since Professor Lim brought up how Ukraine could be unsatisfactory about this kind of proposal, Malcolm, I'd like to ask you, though Ukraine's official reportedly said it will not have any 38th parallel, is there any possibility that Ukraine would have to accept this option?
No, because I think the difference between the Korean Peninsula and Ukraine is that the Ukrainians are literally fighting for their lives. It's not just about territory, it's not just about towns. As we've seen in Russian-occupied areas and towns such as Bucha, Severodonetsk, Mariupol, and other towns, the Russians are butchering civilians in the streets. They're committing gross human rights violations. So the Ukrainians understand that if they accept a negotiated solution that could lead to some sort of armistice like the 38th parallel, then they sacrifice the population in those Russian-controlled areas. And that is an unacceptable cost. So the Ukrainians firmly believe, and I believe this is correct, that they can fight the war and retake those areas, those areas such as Donetsk, Luhansk, Zaporizhia, Kherson, and Crimea, and retake all of Ukrainian territory and force the Russians out, and then basically achieve victory.
Right, we'll have to have our fingers crossed for that. But Professor Lim, I wonder if Russia's so-called Korean-style armistice the proposal is true, what is the true intentions behind Russia's such proposal?
Well, I agree with Mr. Malcolm's that observation. Again, it cannot be a really meaningful solution, again, for the Ukraine, because Russia invaded. Russia was the one who invaded Ukraine's territory, and they occupied the 4 regions, and they unilaterally declared those 4 regions are now the territories of Russia. So having had this kind of, again, the situations, again, the making a line like a 38th parallel cannot, of course, probably make a census to the Ukrainian people. But again, Russia, from Russia's point of view, again, they combined the Crimean Peninsula before, and now they combine those 4 regions. So probably if they can make at least armistice, still they expanded their territory. If we compare their original territory and today's those land. So again, this armistice can be a very controversial, especially to the Ukrainian people. But what I was trying to say was, as long as all this stalemate situations last long. If so, all this, victim sacrifices will be increasing too. So at some point, probably some negotiations or dialogues might be necessary. That's what I wanted to actually highlight. Mm-hmm.
Right. Now, Malcolm, former high-ranking U.S. officials such as Condoleezza Rice and Robert Gates wrote in an article for the Washington Post that time is not on Ukraine's side and that the U.S. and its allies should urgently provide Ukraine with a dramatic increase in military supplies to not let Russia get into a strong position to invade after a ceasefire agreement. What is your takeaway on such a view, and what kind of major breakthrough do you believe Ukraine would need to win this war?
Well, I think the Condoleezza Rice, Bob Gates piece is very good because it identifies the reality that if we do give Russia a ceasefire, if we give them a armistice agreement, then they'll use that to rebuild their forces so that they can launch the war again in the future. So they're not interested in peace. What they want is to complete the domination of Ukraine. And that's why we can't give in to that sort of solution. And in terms of the military capabilities that Ukraine needs, there's now movement in terms of main battle tanks that are coming from Europe. The French, the British, the Poles are all coming on board in terms of supplying main battle tanks. The Americans probably will, following their dispatch of Bradley fighting vehicles. The Germans are the holdouts here. They don't want to get involved in this. Tanks are important in terms of countering any large-scale Russian offensive that's going to occur earlier this year. The other key capability that I think the Ukrainians have been calling for and should get is long-range missiles like ATACMS for use with HIMARS. And they've got the short-range missiles for HIMARS, which they've been using very effectively. But what they need is the longer-range ATACMS missiles that would give them the ability to strike into the Russian rear and attack their logistics very effectively. And that could completely neutralize Russia's ability to launch any offensive. Then the Ukrainians would be in a position to launch counteroffensives and retake territory. So I'm not convinced that it's a stalemate situation at the moment. I believe we're on the verge of both sides being ready to launch offensives.
Right. Now, shifting gears a little bit, Professor Lim, prompted by Russia's aggression, the EU and NATO vowed new cooperation to address growing geostrategic competition by Russia and China. How should we see this new Cold War developing?
Well, this is a kind of inevitable trend because, but the thing is, we call this new trend as a new Cold War, but this new Cold War cannot be the same with the old Cold War, again, that we experienced in the 20th century. Because in the era of Cold War, basically these two blocs, they didn't need to exchange their resources or human resources. The blocs were more like a kind of exclusive to their own supporters. So economic cooperation between the blocs actually didn't exist. In the era of Cold War. But in this new Cold War era, all this economic interdependence is very deep, even though U.S. is now trying to restructure a global value chain, reshoring, friendshoring, all the things are ongoing, but still complete decoupling, for example, with China, is probably almost impossible. So what I'm trying to say is, even though we do see conflicts, competitions, those things, between the major power, but at the same time, we also do see inevitable cooperation or interdependence as well. But still, those, competition and conflicts cannot but last for a while, because again, none of China, neither China nor the U.S. wants to lose, its those position as the leader of the world.
Right, so conflicts would continue, but the interdependence is not the one that we can miss out, right? Well, Malcolm, an interesting viewpoint came out saying defeat for the Kremlin in Ukraine would lead to the possibility of Russia's collapse and disintegration, and that policymakers would have to prepare themselves for change in Eurasian politics. It could be a little early to say, of course, but if the Kremlin does fail, do you believe there could be a major spiral of change in global politics?
Yeah, I think that's quite a distinct possibility. I think there are two scenarios emerging if Russia's war in Ukraine fails, the Russian forces are comprehensively defeated. The first is, as you suggest, the Putin regime is removed. maybe there's a power vacuum at the top and Russia quickly disintegrates in the same way that the Soviet Union disintegrated between 1989 and 1991. And so then we would see the world's largest country essentially coming apart. And the real risk there is that Russia has large numbers of nuclear weapons. So the West would have to be concerned about what's known as positive control over those nuclear weapons. Who has them, who has access to them, and where do they go? And that would be a real concern, I think, in addition to the risk of large-scale ethno-nationalist conflict occurring across the length and breadth of Russia. The other scenario that occurs is even more worrying, and that is that Putin, facing defeat, reaches for tactical nuclear weapons and uses tactical nuclear weapons in Ukraine, because then NATO would have to intervene directly to attack Russia at the conventional level, and the risk would be of a rapid escalation from there. And I think we all understand where that leads. Neither outcome is desirable. What we want is a Ukrainian victory that avoids those two outcomes, but we are threading the strategic needle here to avoid those two outcomes.
All right. Unfortunately, that is all the time we have for today's edition. But thank you for your insights, Professor Lim. And of course, thank you, Malcolm, for your insights as well. We appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Now, that's all for Within the Frame tonight. Have a great rest of the evening. We will be back tomorrow with more in-depth stories on the issues happening in South Korea and, of course, around the globe. Thank you for watching, and goodbye.